I want to begin with a very simple point. When a government says a war is nearing some kind of resolution, do not start by listening to the words. Start by asking what systems are actually becoming normal. Again, are troops going home? Are shipping costs normalizing? Are regional actors calming down? Are secondary fronts shrinking? Are commercial flows resuming without special negotiation? If the answer is no, then the war is not winding down. It is merely being narrated that way. That is exactly why this document matters. Because the most valuable thing in it is not the headline drama about Trump going silent. The most valuable thing is the structural contradiction underneath the silence. Washington wants to speak as if negotiations are close, but the region is behaving as if the conflict is evolving into a longer and more fragmented order. That is the real story. Iran rejected the ceasefire proposal because, in its view, talks with a side that has already broken commitments are not a path to security. That is not just diplomatic language, that is strategic positioning. Iran is saying that it will not let the timing of the endgame be dictated by the White House. It wants guarantees, reparations, and a broader redefinition of the military environment around it. Whether one agrees with that or not is not the point. The point is that this is not the language of a side preparing to quietly fold under pressure. And once you understand that, you can see why the rest of the region starts to look different. Take Hormuz. The ordinary news version of Hormuz is always the same. Is it open or closed? Are ships getting through or not? Are tankers delayed or moving? That is too shallow. The more serious reading is that Hormuz is now being used as an instrument for rewriting regional hierarchy. Iran is not simply blocking the lane in an all or nothing way. It is demonstrating that access itself can become conditional, political, negotiated, and monetized. That is a massive shift because once a strategic choke point becomes a place where permission, fees, alignment, and selective passage start to matter more than old assumptions about neutral flow, the global system is no longer dealing with disruption alone. It is dealing with a new template. This is why the detail about a toll-like system is so important. People hear that phrase and think in narrow commercial terms. I hear something else. I hear statecraft. I hear a message that says the old order where the United States guarantees open transit and everyone else lives inside that guarantee may not be the order governing the next phase of the region. And when that message is backed by risk to LNG, fertilizer, helium, and broader energy markets, it begins to move from theory into material power. This is where Trump's silence becomes more than optics. Because if your administration is trying to tell markets and allies that progress is being made, but the most important corridor in the region is still operating under coercive uncertainty, then your messaging is not closing the gap. It is exposing the gap. Now add another layer. The document describes how the White House appear to be using words and appearances to influence markets, while the fundamental problems remain unresolved. That is a dangerous habit in wartime. Markets can tolerate bad news better than they can tolerate unstable credibility. Once traders, insurers, partners, and adversaries begin to suspect that official optimism is serving political timing more than strategic truth, every statement becomes weaker. And in war, weak statements are not just a communications problem. They create strategic temptation for the other side. If Iran sees that Washington is trying to project progress because it cannot afford the appearance of drift, then Iran learns something very important. It learns that time may not be neutral. Time may actually be on its side. That is how asymmetric pressure works. You do not need to overpower a larger opponent across the board. You need to identify the places where his own narrative burdens become liabilities. You need to make him choose between admitting failure, escalating risk, or speaking in contradictions. That is the trap. And the document shows us several pieces of that trap at once. Trump reportedly receives highly compressed success focus briefings. That matters because leaders who are fed war in summary form often become captives of curated momentum. They begin to believe that if the visuals look decisive, the strategy must also be decisive. But war does not care what the montage looks like. War cares whether the system underneath has changed. Has Hormuz? No. Has Iran accepted American timing? No. Has the region aligned behind Washington? No. Has Iraq stabilized? No. Has Israel's timeline shortened? No. In fact, the document points toward Israeli intelligence talking in terms of a year for regime change. A year that is not a short campaign. That is a prolonged strategic project. So ask yourself the obvious question. If one major player is speaking in the language of a long war, if Iraq is beginning to look like a live secondary theater, again, if militias are retaliating, if Turkish diplomacy is pressing Gulf states not to join, and if Hormuz remains economically coercive, then what exactly is being wound down? The answer is simple, not the war, only the presentation, and that is unsustainable. The Iraq layer here deserves particular attention. A strike on a shared Iraqi facility, followed by authorization for militia retaliation and visible drone pressure against American assets, is not background noise. It is a reminder that regional conflict never stays on one map for long, once Iraq begins to react not as a passive corridor, but as an arena with its own sovereignty and armed response. The geometry of the war changes. Now, the United States is not merely dealing with Iran, it is dealing with the consequences of operating in a region where every military action can create a new front, a new grievance, a new retaliation chain. That is the kind of war strong powers hate most. Not because they cannot strike. They can strike, not because they lack hardware, they have hardware. They hate it because every tactical action enlarges the political problem. That is why I think the most important line in this whole story is not about Trump personally. It is about structure. The war is no longer just about defeating a target. It is about whether the United States can still impose a regional order that others actually obey. And here, the signs are poor. Turkey is counseling restraint, not coalition. Iraq is reacting against American action, not folding into it. Iran is rejecting imposed timelines. Shipping is not normal. Markets are jumpy. Troops are moving. And yet the public line tries to suggest that objectives are being met and that everything remains under control. This is what overextension looks like before it becomes undeniable. You can hear it in the language, no boots on the ground, but more troops heading in. Operation almost done, but a giant global project still required. Ceasefire coming, but no ceasefire accepted. Stability promised, but the whole region forced to calculate around new uncertainty. When I see this pattern, I do not think the most important question is whether Trump personally has gone mute. The more important question is this. What happens when the system starts teaching every actor in the region that American declarations are provisional? That escalation can spill into Iraq, Hormuz can be turned to a political toll gate, and then even a stronger power may not know how to conflict it open. That lesson, once learned, does not stay in one war. It spreads. It shapes the next negotiation. It shapes the next confrontation. It shapes how allies hedge and how rivals probe. That is why this moment matters, because the war is not only causing damage, it is producing a new strategic education for everyone watching. Iran seems to understand that if it keeps enough levers active at once, Washington will struggle to create a clean victory narrative, keep Hormuz conditional, keep the market nervous, keep Iraq unsettled, keep allies divided, keep the war difficult to package. That may be enough to deny the United States the one thing it needs most in this phase, which is a believable story that the conflict is moving toward closure under American terms. And if that story cannot be made believable, then silence becomes inevitable. Not because the leader has suddenly grown cautious, but because every available sentence makes the contradiction worse. So when I look at Trump's disappearance from the center of the public frame, I do not see resolution. I see a tactical retreat from explanation. I see an administration that cannot yet tell the truth without admitting drift, and cannot keep bluffing without increasing the costs of the bluff. And that is why this is bigger than one title, one clip, or one day of silence. This is about a region moving away from the old assumption that the United States can define both the terms of pressure and the terms of peace. If that assumption keeps eroding, then what comes next will not be a temporary crisis. It will be a different Middle East, more fragmented, more negotiated, more expensive, and much harder for Washington to dominate with words alone.